So I think for me, it's the idea that we live in a world of sound. And so I think a nice analogy of the relationship between biodiversity and bioacoustics is thinking of an orchestra where you have all of these different sounds coming from all over the room, and each of those sounds is corresponding to a different instrument section. And so whether you're in the jungle or whether you're on a coral reef, in many ways, these animal orchestras that fill ecosystems are the same sort of thing. And so, by communicating through sound or eavesdropping on these ecosystems, we can get an idea of who's there, what are they doing, what are they saying, how many are there. We can listen to predator prey interactions. There's the description of, many of these sounds represent, sex and death in nature when they're used for courtship or feeding events. And so just by listening, we can understand all of these fundamental processes of biodiversity and nature just through this perspective of sound.
Sound is just one of the modality for us to sense the world. And I think, in a way, the variety of sound that's out there, and if you want to kind of put it in broad buckets, it's like if you think about biophony, which is biological sound, which we're talking about here. But there's also, geophony, which is, a lot of the arts, geological process that creates a sound of its own. And then the more increasingly anthropophony, which is our contribution in this acoustic space and the world. And all this coming together and creating a kind of a song of a place. And if you listen to it, you will hear that song. And, sometimes it would be composed by, crickets and earthquakes and traffic. Sometimes it could be something very, very different and very much centered around biodiversity or biological contributors. But as I said, it's one of the modalities. So when I think about biodiversity, it doesn't directly translate into acoustic biodiversity because not everybody's singing at the same time. So when you're listening in, you're getting a slice in the continuum of time to listen to the singers of that space and that time. And by then tuning into it, you kind of see what variety of singers are in there. Insects, animals, all different types of living organisms, right? And that, to me, is a representation of acoustic diversity, of what types of organisms are out there. And if we want to put a little bit of a value judgment in there, the diversity that potentially reflects the health of the space, so to speak. And that kind of goes into a little bit of the realm of conservation. But that's what I see as describing acoustic biodiversity.
What is the intrinsic value of biodiversity and the importance of biodiversity to the planet and how it functions and how it benefits us as humans, I think is a really fundamental concept that I think in light of, the Anthropocene and major biodiversity losses, I think the increasing public awareness of biodiversity is a good thing. Now, the fundamental question becomes, is it too little, too late, or can we have and be able to catalyze a mass movement to prioritize the preservation of biodiversity to stem what may be the latest mass extinction event?
what I would add to it is that, oftentimes we want to find a focus in our experiences. Even for us, we are at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, right? So we find bird as the focal point for us to engage with conservation, science, public engagement, or whatever avenue you want to think about it. So we need to find a focus, and then when we understand that focal point, then we kind of radiate out from there. But I don't think that happens very naturally. It's when you're taken there and then given the experiences that, yeah, you can care about birds, but if you're not understanding what's going on in their context, are you really understanding birds? Are you really understanding their kind of life cycle, life history, or conservation? So that's taken from us as directly involved in science to somebody coming to a museum or a zoo or an exhibit space where they're kind of presented with a lot of different concepts and contexts, but they might find their focal point and move on with it. But until and unless you present it as a context that, oh, you might be seeing a cricket, but cricket lives in this context. It provides food for the birds, maybe, but it also is an architect under at the ground level habitat of that space. So unless you connect that and show people the context, I think that's not very easily accessible to talk about biodiversity and having an intentional understanding of that. So I think for us as exhibitor, we need to do a little bit better job to take people through that process, because it is, a lot of our work, we are kind of focusing on the ecosystem-based solutions rather than a species-based solution. Because what we're seeing is that when you don't understand the ecosystem, when you don't understand the context, you cannot really make a big difference into the life and livelihood and the life cycle and life history of an organism. In a lot of ways, we talk about, our lab specializes at, understanding ecology and conservation at scale. So you can understand one organism, like, in a small bucket or in a small pond or a small garden. But if that species has a very broad range of how they function, where they feed, where they breed, and where they travel, and you don't understand the context, you kind of miss out a lot about the context of the species, and later on, the diversity that supports, or the ecosystem that supports that species to be successful.
for me, what is always exciting is when you start to find, universal is probably being too broad, but these really, widely distributed phenomena in nature that sort of highlights sort of the commonality of animals writ large, that, we're not, as humans, we're not nearly as unique or as special sometimes as we think we are, and so, with that in mind, in the context of vocalizations, the idea too that, for most vertebrates, sounds are produced either in reproductive contexts or in sort of aggression and agonistic contexts. And this is true all the way from fish all the way up to humans. And sure, there's some iterations on a theme, but those are the general contexts. So by listening to the sounds that are being produced, we can get an idea of what are these animals doing? What are they in the mood for? Are they defending a territory? Are they looking for mates? Are they having a throwdown with their neighbor? Are they looking for food? We can start to pick up on what's happening. I think what's also really exciting too is the number of organisms across the animal kingdom that are combining different aspects of gestures or movement and these vocalizations to help emphasize this message in what we refer to as a multimodal display. So you'll have fish that are doing, dips and sort of making these purring sounds on coral reefs. You'll have lyrebirds in Australia that are literally singing and dancing at the same time. So being able to start to see, how animals have multiple ways of trying to share their message, I think is really neat. And to see how that emerges again and again across the animal kingdom, I think, to the previous question, how do you think about biodiversity? It's like biodiversity is weird and it's wonderful. And it gets so exciting to see all of these different ways that animals use behavior and sound to solve different problems.
What I would also add to that is that, some of the organisms that we study, they have a very complex systems, complex life cycle, long, prolonged life cycle. And in many ways, our ability to study them is that's our limitation. You cannot study a, gray whale or a bowhead whale or a right whale in the detail and the context that is needed to understand that psychological connection between their vocalization and their being. So we are kind of limited also by our own imagination and abilities. And the second thing I would say is that in many ways, these organisms need to be understood beyond the human framework of vocalization and emotions and communications. And I think when we kind of allow ourselves that creative space, that's when we'll probably start to understand the species and what it means for them. So what I would say, we're kind of limited by our own imagination for what's going on in nature and kind of the communication channel of some of these species.
And to touch on the neuroscience component of it, what's exciting is that many vertebrates, starting with fishes all the way up the vertebrate tree of life, have specialized nuclei in the hindbrain dedicated to vocalization. Mm-hmm. And so we know how different areas of the forebrain and the midbrain are innervating the hindbrain, which then projects neurons, and in many cases highly specialized nerve cells, to go to dedicated anatomy specifically evolved to produce sound. So in a case of some of the fish that we study, my mentor and colleague Andy Bass on campus has shown that when you put an electrode in the brain, the part of the brain in the midbrain that will ultimately generate sounds is producing a spike pattern that corresponds one-to-one with the output coming from the hindbrain that's going to the muscles. You've measured the activity in the muscles, it's that same patterning that then corresponds exactly to those peaks in the sound itself. So we have this one-to-one correspondence between what's happening in the brain and the sound that these fish are emanating. And so what gets to be kind of exciting and a little bit mind-blowing is that, we have these hydrophones, we can listen to the rocky intertidal shores in California, and we can listen to a population of fish. But not only hearing those fish, knowing the relationship between the brain and the sounds, we're actually getting insight into what's happening into the individual brains of all of these fish along the coastline. And so we can go from brain cell all the way up to population level interactions, all through this medium of sound. There's many different aspects of empathy. I think, as a human, the idea of bioacoustic empathy is using sound to appreciate, either others or the world around us. I think we don't, to Ashik's point of not fully understanding what these animals do and how they work, and only having just scratching the surface despite, thousands of years of science. I don't think we know enough about the cognitive capabilities of most animals. And so I think, as there's a little bit of humility that we need to have as scientists, be able to say, okay, what do we understand and what don't we understand? And so, things like empathy, as a scientist, I'm most comfortable talking about sort of in the human domain and not overly projecting, what a fish or a whale might be thinking or feeling. But so I like the idea of bioacoustic empathy is the idea, for me, it's the idea of using sound to either appreciate others or appreciate the world around me and have some emotional insight into what's happening for me as the listener.